So over the last years, we've seen dramatic improvements in robotics capabilities to reason about the immediate environment, to reason about objects in the environment and people. And this talk, I just want to give you some examples for the kind of work that's been going on in that domain. This is mostly from my own research, but it's just an example for what the wider community has really achieved over the last years. So before I get there, let's step back a little bit in time and talk about the main sensor that people used in robotics about 7 years ago. This is a SICK 2D laser scanner, the blue little box on that robot that you see there. And what it does is it shoots out a beam of laser light and scans the environment. And what you see in the left is kind of how we can put that on a robot. And now the robot is driving through a building, and we can use that to build a map of that building. Okay, so here the white space is free space and black are obstacles. And these kind of maps, we've been working on that for more than a decade, actually very well suited for navigation tasks, because as you can see, the robot can use it, for example, to plan paths through the environment. It can also make sure that it doesn't crash into walls, because the laser scanner tells it where the walls are. The same for people. But you can also see that that is an extremely limited representation of the environment. I think ultimately where we want to go is toward robots that can interact with people in a much more natural way than what you've seen on the previous slide, where it's mostly about navigation tasks. So imagine we put a robot in a wet lab, a smart wet lab assistant, and you would like to teach the robot what it should be doing. So there are things like you want to tell it what the test tubes look like, then you want to be able to tell it what to do with these test tubes, how to shake it. It turns out that's actually pretty important. And finally, you want to also then instruct it how to perform a complex procedure with you. Right, where it's not only the robot or only you doing tasks, but you should do these kind of jointly together. For the robot, in order to understand that, of course, one main task is natural language understanding, and Chris already talked a lot about that. And also the community over the last years had made a lot of progress on how to combine natural language understanding to robotics. I could just point you to some publications down there. But I want to focus more on the perceptual side of that problem, which is very much related to the work also that Fei talked about. So as you can imagine, the robot needs to be able to detect objects, recognize objects, also see where the person is. It's not enough for the robot to know where the human hand is, but it even needs to know how the human holds the hand and how you are shaking an object and things like that. So what we need is a really fine-grained 3D understanding of what is going on in the scene, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can achieve that. What you can see on that slide is what the world looks like to a so-called depth camera. These are the cameras that came out around in 2009. They are the main sensor behind the Microsoft Kinect Xbox game, where they are actually being used to track the human playing a game like a Dance Central or something like that. These are extremely useful for robots as well, and what you see here on the left-hand side is a normal color stream that the camera captures, but on the right side is a really interesting part for roboticists, which is so-called depth information. So that camera tells us for every pixel how far that pixel is away from the robot or from the camera in the world. And that's extremely useful, especially if you want a robot to be able to interact with the world and to also pick up objects, because knowing the distance to the object is, of course, extremely useful. So these kind of sensors really had a huge impact on the robotics community. What you can see on the left-hand side is, for example, a 3D map we can build with such a camera, just by walking through the lab and pointing the camera at different locations, and we can get very nice 3D colored reconstructions. We can also build these, for example, by putting a camera on a quadcopter or on a mobile robot that points the camera at different locations. These 3D maps are also very useful for robots, for example, to plan tasks such as opening doors and opening drawers and things like that. On the right-hand side, you can see how a robot could actually build object models. So the idea is that if the robot walks around and sees an object it hasn't seen yet before, it can actually pick it up and hold it in front of its own camera, kind of the way we would do it maybe intuitively, and then build a 3D model of that object. The underlying technique is very similar to building a model of the environment. Okay, now that the robot has a 3D model of the environment, it has 3D model of objects, we can also reason more about more dedicated manipulation tasks, as you can see here. This is something we did in collaboration with the German Aerospace Center. On the upper left, you can see kind of the viewpoint of the robot as it's manipulating an object. And on the lower left, you can see a model of the robot's own hands and the objects that the robot is tracking with a depth camera. So we're trying to align these data sources so that it matches what the robot perceives, and now the robot can perform very nice manipulation tasks. And it's also robust, for example, when the robot drops an object. Because we do all this in real time in closed loop control, we can detect immediately when the object falls down. The problem with humans is, of course, they don't stand still, which means you cannot assume that they are just like a rigid environment. So we had to develop some techniques that enables us to build 3D models of people as they are moving. Okay, as you can see here, on the right-hand side is a 3D model that we can build in real time as the camera is moving around the person and the person is moving herself. One problem also with people is that tracking them is much more complicated because they change their shape as they're moving. So this is where deep learning techniques, we heard this already multiple times today, are extremely useful, where on the upper row you can see how we can map from how we can train a neural network to detect a hand. You can see this blue box that is detected by the neural network. And in the lower part of the picture, you see what a neural network generates that focuses just on the bounding box generated by the first networks and then detects all these different points on the hand that you can see on the lower right part. So we now have a system that can very robustly actually track human hands in real time and requiring no initialization of that tracker. Okay, so far I only talked about low-level tracking tasks. Wait, this should, let me go there again. Yeah, low-level tracking tasks. Of course, we also want to see what the person is actually doing. Here you can see a simple example of what you can do if you can detect certain objects, if you can detect which objects a human is interacting with. And here we are tracking actually a recipe. So the thing you can see on the lower line is what the system is really detecting here, like pouring something from the small bowl in the mixing bowl. And I'm virtually done here with clicker. Here's one brief example application in this domain is helping people with physical disabilities. For example, where a mobile robot could then use these kind of techniques to also help a person shave himself or, for example, pulling up a blanket. So let me summarize now. Over the last years, we've seen really dramatic improvements in robot abilities to detect and track objects, manipulate them, and also reason about people and their activities. Over the next years, we can use these kind of techniques to greatly increase the collaborative capabilities of robots, how they can coordinate with people. And there are many very exciting application domains for these kind of robot systems, such as healthcare, elder care, small-scale manufacturing, science experimentation, as you saw in the biology wet lab, and also areas like disaster response, and finally also just general home services. Thank you very much.